this afternoon. I'm Ann Hendry, the CEO at the Nonprofit Association of the Midlands, and we're really pleased today to bring you some just-in-time information on the American Rescue Plan Act. This is the most recent initiative to help nonprofits. Well, we're focusing on nonprofits today. It helps communities at large. And we're thankful that the National Council of Nonprofits is leading the guidance on this. If you've been getting our emails since last year at this time, anytime it's a policy issue from CARES Act to today, we use the expertise of the National Council of Nonprofits. And if you're a member of NAM, you're automatically a member of the National Council. So with that, I'd like to also introduce Hannah Young. She is our public policy person, and she'll introduce our speakers. Hannah?
Thanks, Anne, and thank you again so much to David and Tiffany who have joined us. They are the experts on this content, so we are so happy they could join us today. I'm just going to give a brief bio really quick. Tiffany Gorla-Carter is the Policy Counsel at the National Council of Nonprofits and works to advance the public policy priorities for the nation's largest network of nonprofits. And David Thompson is the Vice President of Public Policy for the National Council of Nonprofits. The organization is active at the local, state, and federal levels, advancing nonprofit priorities in the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of the government. And he was also recently honored as one of the Nonprofit Times Power and Influence Top 50 for 2019 and 2020. So congrats to David for that. He's also an expert in podcasting and has recently interviewed on a podcast related to tax policy and how it impacts tax-exempt organizations. So I will put that in the chat in just a second, but we welcome both of you. And again, thank you so much. And I will turn it over to Tiffany.
Thanks, Hannah and Ann. It's wonderful to be with everyone in the Midlands, in Nebraska and Iowa. As someone who went to college in Colorado and is originally from Pennsylvania, I have spent many, many hours driving across your states. So I've seen a lot of corn and I've seen a lot of highway, but it's good to be back. And we are excited to be talking about the American Rescue Plan with everyone. I've sat in a lot of meetings lately with members of Congress, and a lot of people have been saying that this has been the single most impactful piece of legislation that they have voted on. Sorry, I have an ambulance going by. Okay, it's passed. But the single most impactful piece of legislation they voted on in their career. So we're excited to be talking about how it affects you and your organizations and your communities. But we always start with this slide. This is the network of the National Council of Nonprofits. Anne is a wonderful board member of our network. And you can see that you have colleagues across the country. So we have experts across the country who are welcome and happy to share their experiences. And because of that, we have all this great information that we can then share with you on what's happening and how it impacts then the various states. So with that, I turn it over to David Thompson. Quick note, we will be keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A. So feel free to ask us questions. We'll interrupt. We're happy to take them as they come. So David.
Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you, Ann and Hannah. And let me emphasize that last point. Please do put your questions in the Q&A or the chat, don't care which. We realize that Nebraska Nice is a thing, and that you might want to wait till the end and not be rude to interrupt. That's why we specially have assigned Tiffany Gorley-Carter the task of being rude, of interrupting, of making sure your questions are answered. So don't be shy, because I know she won't be on your behalf. Thank you. We're talking about the American Rescue Plan Act. It was signed into law on March 11th, so 6 weeks ago, right about today. And there's a lot of different interpretations of what it is. It was a 1.9 or so trillion dollar bill, legislation, law that did a lot of things. Some would say it's a new day dawning. Some would say it's a gold at the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, or it's the help is finally coming for nonprofits. The law has a lot of things in it that we're not going to talk about. The $1,400 or the $1,200 checks that went to $1,400 checks that went to individuals, the extension of unemployment insurance and the increased unemployment insurance benefits, the supplemental benefits extended until early September. A lot of other things, childcare, funding for vaccines, for testing, for schools, the whole bit. Not going to talk about those. We're talking specifically about the nonprofit issues in particular. I'm going to run through a variety of the let's call them silos of issues. Tiffany's going to cover some, and then we'll get to what next. And then, but we will answer questions all the way through. You don't have to take notes about all the details of what we're saying, because there's this chart that we put together. It's a cheat sheet of the key issues and what's in them. That will be made available to you after the call. And that other article there with the dollar signs, that's a cheat sheet or a how-to guide for getting money back immediately under the employee retention tax credit that I'm going to talk about. But that's an article, that's a blog posting. It's going to be updated for 2021 as well, but it's a useful tool that will be made available to you. So focus on what I'm saying and what I'm not saying and what you want to learn more on. Don't try to keep track of the little details, because those are readily available elsewhere. I'll start with the biggest, most obvious issue, the Paycheck Protection Program. First, I'll ask a question. Did you realize that nonprofits were mostly left out of the PPP when the first draft of the CARES Act was written 13 months ago? It was advocacy from NAM, from the Midlands. It was advocacy from that map you saw earlier that Tiffany showed you of all the state associations across the country. We are an awesome grassroots network when we're working together. So when you do see an action alert from Hannah or Ann, please do respond, because we are able to build and improve and get more justification and fairness for nonprofits when we are advocating them. Paycheck Protection Program, the inclusion of nonprofits, is an example of nonprofit advocacy in action. And I just wanted to flag that at the very beginning. The American Rescue Plan Act has some key improvements that we fought for the entirety of 2020. Most of you know that the PPP only applied to nonprofits with 500 or fewer employees. Lots of for-profit businesses with more than 500 employees had access to the Paycheck Protection Program. Clear discrimination against nonprofits for a variety of reasons, capped at 500. If you had more than 500 employees, full-time or part-time, you're left out. We fixed that. When I say we, I mean nonprofit advocacy with the leadership, et cetera, in Congress, so that if your nonprofit has more than 500 employees, but no more than 500 per location, then you are eligible for the first draw of the Paycheck Protection Program. Same rule for the second draw. Second draw has the requirement that you have to have fewer than 300 employees, and you had to suffer a decline in revenues or gross receipts of 25% in any of the quarters last year compared to 2019. A little bit complicated, but there's the 300 employee number for the second draw. Both of those for nonprofits now say that if you have fewer than 500 per location and fewer than 300 per location for those two different draws, you can apply for the PPP. And the American Rescue Plan added more money, but great big caveat. It was extended. The program was extended. It was supposed to die on March 31st, and it was extended to May 31st for applications, but that money is running out. Latest predictions we've read, or we've been talking with people at SBA and on Capitol Hill, is that money is going to run out next week, the first week of May. So it won't hurt my feelings if you stop listening now and go ahead and fill out that application. First draw or second draw, you need to get it in before the money runs out. That deadline of you can't wait till May 30th and be golden, because there won't be any money left. So it is critical that you apply right now. That last bullet or check I have on the screen there says that the shuttered venue program overlaps. Tiffany, did you have a PPP question?
Yes, and this is a very key question that we've gotten a lot. So back whenever we were working on extending the provision to include more nonprofits, there was also the question about whether, like, who could qualify for the second draw, right? So this question of, if you had decreased revenues or you had to show this loss. So there was that question about it. Can you explain what the outcome was, like what your requirements are to be able to take the second draw?
Sure. Three criteria. One, you received a first draw and spent it. I'll come back to that. That's number one. Number two, you have fewer than 300 or fewer employees. And three, you suffered a decline of 25% in gross receipts. That's a technical term, from one quarter in 2020 compared to the same quarter in 2019. So any of the quarters of 2020 compared to any of the quarters of 2019. You could have made more money in 3 quarters in 2020, but had less than 25% in one quarter, and then you qualified. Gross receipts is defined as a technical definition. The first version, the first draft that came out, was absolutely the worst bit of legislative drafting I've ever seen in my life. What they did was they picked, I'll give you the technical answer that you can look up very easily, and it's explained in our materials. It's the definition as used in section 6033 of the Internal Revenue Code. It's a specific definition, and it means all gross receipts. And if you ever look at your form 990, gross receipts is in a box on the first page. That's essentially that number. You're already calculating it if you do file a form 990. There are some that using that definition versus some other create some winners and losers, but it's the best, most accurate across the board definition for nonprofits. Hope that answered it. The Small Business Administration has a variety of answers to frequently asked questions and some interim guidance on that issue. And they have a whole page on second draw that should be helpful. I was going to quickly say on that last bullet there, the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant Program. That's for performing arts, both for-profit and nonprofit, like orchestras. I know the Omaha Orchestra has an office right downtown in Omaha that I saw a few years ago. They are eligible. The system itself is very, very complicated, and the Small Business Administration has had a terrible time getting it to work. They were supposed to open the portal. It's a grant program based on how much money your revenues, lost revenues, and things like that. Grant program, not a loan. And it's taken a long time, and it finally opened today. It was supposed to open on April 8th, and it crashed. The system crashed. They discovered all kinds of problems. And then it was going to open on Saturday, this past Saturday at 12:30 Eastern. And people realized, ooh, that's a bad day. So it opened today at noon. So an hour and 14 minutes ago, I went online at noon, or right at a little after noon, and was 7,000th in line. So there are tens of thousands of groups are going to be applying for it. If you are eligible, and that means you're a performing arts venue, then you can go ahead and go online to SVOG. I wrote it down. SVOG Grant Portal, and that'll get you in line. And go ahead and do that now while we're talking, so that you can get in line and figure out whether you can apply. The good news is you can still get a PPP, Paycheck Protection Program loan, and a shuttered venue grant. That was not the case until the American Rescue Plan was enacted. So that was an improvement. Ultimately, the most you can get is whatever dollar figure the shuttered venue grant program would give you. They just subtract the PPP loan from the shuttered venue grant. That's all I plan to say about that, because not as many nonprofits are affected by the shuttered venue overlap. Next topic is the Employee Retention Tax Credit. I showed you earlier a blog article that explained it in more detail. Employee Retention Tax Credit was created as part of the CARES Act, and it was improved at the year-end COVID law, and was improved again in the American Rescue Plan Act. You see on the line there, it's a tax credit. We're nonprofits. We can't use income tax credits. Why are we talking about it? Because it's not an income tax credit, the bane of our existence. It's a refundable payroll tax credit. Refundable payroll tax credit. In my mind, those are the 4 most beautiful words in the English language, because that means even if you don't pay taxes, or you do have payroll taxes for your employees, This is a system that Congress came up with, advocated for by the nonprofit community, by our network. Remember the map you saw, advocated by us for 10 years, trying to get Congress to recognize nonprofits are people too. Nonprofits are valid, valuable employers in communities. You need to include us in these programs. They included us in the refundable payroll tax credit, meaning you get money back from the federal government based on the calculations. The current rule for 2020 is that you can retroactively apply for the Employee Retention Tax Credit. The nickname is ERTC, not that good a nickname. You can apply for it even if you got a Paycheck Protection Program loan. That blog article explains in sufficient detail how to do that. You can get up to $5,000 per employee. In 2021, that credit went from $5,000 per employee to $7,000 per employee per quarter. So that potentially for 2021, you could be getting back from the federal government $28,000 per employee. There are eligibility requirements. You have to be suffering state ordered or COVID demanded full shutdown of operations or partial shutdown of operations. Those partially shut down operations could still qualify. An example is that my wife runs a vision organization that has thrift stores. The thrift stores here in Virginia, in Alexandria, Virginia, have been closed by order of the mayor. So those employees would qualify. She keeps them on the payroll and can get the tax credit for their salaries. There is overlap with the PPP. You can't double dip. And there's a size restriction in that employers with 500 and more employees can only apply it to those who are kept on and not able to work because of COVID. So it can be complicated, but it is money at hand. Again, my wife's example, her organization got a $200,000 Paycheck Protection Program loan that's now been forgiven last year. They've also applied for $79,000 in ERTC credits, meaning there's real money here, substantial and worth taking a close look at. Next slide is the Economic Injury Disaster Loan. This isn't a new program. It was, Tiffany, you wanted to ask about the other one?
Yeah, can we go back real quick? So Anne brought up that Nebraska never mandated a shutdown mandate. So is there any difference in a state that didn't have a forced closure, or like if there was other circumstances that caused a closure, even if it wasn't mandated by the government?
If you had to shut down because of COVID, shut down an operation, then it doesn't require the state shutdown or a mayor shutdown or some governmental agency requiring it. So if a federal agency or anyone else ordered it, that's the easiest example. But if you had to shut down, let's say you had an outbreak, so you shut down for a period of time, then you can qualify. Actually, when Congress wrote the CARES Act back in March of 2020, no one thought that there would be government-wide shutdowns. That was a surprise. So it was written with the concept that if you have to shut down because of COVID, not necessarily from a government order, but had to do so out of reality, then you applied. Okay. Only quickly on the EIDL, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan. This was expanded. It's a loan, it's not a grant, or it's not a forgivable loan, so it's not as good or popular. But the EIDL, they re-upped it, they expanded it, or got it going again. You can get up to $10,000 grants for small employers in low-income communities. So that's for-profit and not-profit alike. The loan amount, SBA did change their rules. Last year, the SBA was very narrow in their interpretation of this program. The SBA within the last month has broadened it so that the amount you can get is relief for a 24-month period, and the lending amount can go up to $500,000 up from $150,000. It's a loan. You have to pay it back. The interest rate is low. The when you have to start paying is delayed, I think 2 years. So it's a viable option for some employers, not all, but some. Next item is the COVID paid sick and family leave provision. I'm not going to go into too much detail on here because the bottom line is that bottom line check on the screen there. This is not mandated. So paid leave is not mandated in the year-end law or the current interpretations. I bring it up, before the CARES Act last year was the Families First Act. It created a mandate that for employers that when there's a shutdown, employees are entitled to a certain amount of paid leave. Wasn't full pay, it was up to a limited amount of money. And for smaller employers, they said that the employers could get, remember that four-word phrase, refundable payroll tax credit. If you provided paid leave under this mandate, you could get money back from the federal government, 100% of the cost. That was extended. First, it was extended at the end of last year through March. Now it's extended through September 30th, so that you can provide payroll, COVID-related paid leave, and the amount was increased. The value of payment of leave up to $10,000, from $10,000 up to $12,000 per employee. Refundable credit. You pay the employees, you can get the refundable credit back. It also expands leave to, this is a key one right now, expands leave to cover the time off for obtaining vaccines, like the 5 hours it took me last Thursday, it would have applied. Last week, the president made a big deal about this, and the IRS put out a fact sheet making it abundantly clear that if you give employees time off or you pay them to go get a vaccination, you can get that money, the 2 hours, or in my case, the 5 hours, back from the federal government for giving people time off for getting the vaccination. And again, none of this is mandated, but it's strongly encouraged, and it's encouraged by the federal government, by the administration, and backed up with refundable payroll tax credits. And now I will turn it over to Tiffany Gorley-Carter.
Thanks, David. So a couple other provisions that nonprofits as employers are really benefiting from under the American Rescue Plan, but also from CARES, this goes back a little bit, is the benefits for unemployment insurance compensation. And so under CARES, there is a provision. So this is what happened last year. This was the huge, big bill before the American Rescue Plan. But under CARES, there was a provision providing coverage for both contributing and reimbursing employers. So employers are broken down into those two buckets. You fall into one of those, depending on which one you do. You probably, your HR or your operations person probably knows off the top of their head which bucket you fall into. It depends on if you pay into the tax, pay the tax into the state trust fund or not. But what it did was the federal government said, if you're a contributing employer and you pay this tax, we'll cover you. And you don't need to worry about these extra costs if you have to lay people off. What they did for the reimbursing employers, and these are the employers who, instead of paying into the tax, they just cover the full costs of unemployment should they have to leave someone go. And because of that, the federal government said, we'll just cover 50% of those costs. And so under the American Rescue Plan, they extended those benefits through September 6, 2021. Before, it was only going to go through the end of the year and then it's going to go through the spring. Now it's through September 6th. So the change for reimbursing employers is starting this month, back in April 1, that 50% coverage went up to 75% coverage. This is really big for both Iowa and Nebraska, because your state governors provided the coverage for the other 50% back last year in 2020. So Nebraska had an executive order, Iowa had an administrative move that provided that extra coverage. So no matter which bucket you fell into, you had this additional benefit, and so you weren't on the hook for these costs. Now in 2021, because this pandemic has gone way longer than anyone was planning whenever these executive orders and moves were made, we don't know what that means for your states right now. And so, I've talked to Anne and Hannah before this call. We need to figure that out because that's going to affect the payouts that you might be on the hook for. So you might be getting these, invoices coming down from your employment offices or labor offices coming up. So that's something to keep an eye on. But the good news is it's not going to be fit for 50%. If you're on the hook, it's going to be for 25%. But hopefully those state actions will carry over and you won't be on the hook for either. All of this to say, we are working very, very hard here at the National Council and with our network, trying to get that full coverage up to 100% and have it be retroactive. We're still working on that. We've been working on that from day one, but we haven't been successful yet. David's smiling because this is something that we are working on day in and day out because we know it's very, very important for reimbursing employers. Next slide. Wonderful, thanks, Anne. So she says she'll reach out to the state and see what we can find out. And that's all we can ask. We don't know what's going on in pretty much any state right now. It's state by state and it's just a question mark, but it's something that we have to work through. So the other big provision under the American Rescue Plan, and this was touted, this was a huge win. This was actually what held up some of the extensions under the last year, was what provisions and what funding the federal government was going to provide for state and local governments under these different stimulus packages. So under the American Rescue Plan, they came to the agreement that they're going to provide $350 billion to state and local governments. This is a massive amount of money for states. Some states, this is looking at 70% of their whole state budget for the year. I don't know what it is in Iowa and Nebraska specifically, but it's a big amount of money whenever you're comparing it to your state budgets. What I do know is when it breaks down, it's being broken down by state population and then by unemployed persons in that state. So we know in Iowa, the total amount that's coming to the state is 2.7 billion. So that's 1.4 to the state, about 1.2 billion to both the metro and to the rural counties. And then in Nebraska, it's $1.8 billion. So once again, the breakdown is because of the population difference in the states and then how many people are unemployed. But the awesome news in this is that in the actual written language of the American Rescue Plan, there is a provision that says this money can be used for nonprofits, period. So we know that that money can go through the states, it can go through the localities. If you work with territories or tribal nations, that money can go to nonprofits providing for your communities. And so that clears up a huge amount of this question mark. And you should be advocating with and creating relationships with different members of these different government agencies and provisions that you can access these funds, because it should go to you. So that is the huge, huge win. And we're hoping that we can, start seeing that money flow out faster. There is a big but in this, and that is about 14 states have sued the federal government over this funding. And so we don't need to go into all the details of it, but the breakdown of it is there's also a provision that says that the states can't be used for tax cuts or for delaying tax increases. And because a lot of states, Nebraska is always kind of on the list of states that are thinking about doing tax reform. Because states are thinking about doing tax reform this year, they were wondering if that means because of this provision, they can't use this money to fill the gaps that would be created by creating tax cuts. And so we're waiting on finding out more information about that. It's a question mark right now. We're putting a lot of pressure on the Treasury to clarify this. And because of these these court filings, there has been some statements made by the Department of Justice and by the tax department on kind of the fluffy area of this, if you will. But it will become clearer in the next couple weeks. The funding, it's about 60% of the money is supposed to go out in 60 days, which is next month. And then the other 40% would go next year. And the states and localities have until the end of 2024 to spend it. So there's not a huge rush in the sense of the money has to go out the door, but there's a huge rush because we all know we need that money to continue doing the work that we do in our communities. So that's the push and pull there. I'm happy to answer questions on it, but the big win in this is that the money can go to nonprofits. David?
Tiffany, I have a question for you.
Yes.
When you say assistance to nonprofits, how could the states and locals send money to nonprofits?
Well, there's lots of ways that they can do it. So they can provide it. So we have these little green bullet points here. The most common way that we're seeing states and locals do this is through grants, often through things like small business grant programs, straight to nonprofit grant programs, things like that. Some states are doing set asides in the $60 million amount straight to nonprofits. Back to the unemployment insurance area that we were just talking about on the last slide, we're seeing if that money can go into the trust fund to shore it up so that will cover for the contributing and for reimbursing employers. And then like payments and services. So if you have an already existing contract or grant through your state or locality, that money can then go to cover that grant or contract. So there's lots of ways. We're trying to figure out the best, and it might vary between the communities. Do we know what Nebraska's plan for distributing funds to nonprofits is yet? We do not know at our level. I don't know if Ann or Hannah might have some insights there, but I haven't heard anything coming out of Nebraska specifically. We've heard things from various states, especially if a Congress member has shown that that's going to be a priority for them. Things that people are often talking about: fixing budgets, filling budget gaps if the state already had one, broadband expansion, childcare, helping affordable housing or homelessness, rental assistance, things like that nonprofits are often providing those services for. Those are often on the top of the priority list for the funds to be used.
Also in that area that you see down at the bottom of the slide, must advocate. Nonprofits can't wait for the governor or policymakers or anyone to think, oh yes, we like nonprofits and they're written in the statute. We should make sure nonprofits are made whole. There's not a single thing we've gotten over the last 14 months during the pandemic or even before that without asking, demanding, agitating, showing good cause and things like that. Throughout the network, Hannah has colleagues throughout the United States who are either coming up with good ideas or are trying to share ideas on how to, what's the best way to get the state to spend that money through nonprofits. This is not us being greedy. This is us recognizing nonprofits exist to serve the public good, and that we aren't, throughout the pandemic, nonprofits have not hibernated, as in hunker down, close our doors, wait for the storm to pass, wait for the disease to pass, and then we'll come back and start fresh. No, nonprofits have been working throughout. We have been the employer. We've brought in people, even at a loss, in order to keep the missions that we're promoting, to keep advancing our missions. So we have a track record. You have a track record of things to demonstrate. You've lost money during the pandemic, most likely. Being made whole is a perfect thing to advocate for. And so grant programs, unemployment insurance that Tiffany was talking about is a major issue for a lot of employers. We have not been successful in getting governments to pay 100% of the cost for reimbursing employers. That's something they could do, spend this money on. And there are initiatives, contracts, expansion of contracts, all kinds of things that, let's face it, nonprofits are the most creative people on earth. You can be creative and come up with some very good, not frivolous, not greedy or anything else, but legitimate ways to spend the money to promote the public good. I'm saying that as an ardent nonprofit advocate, and think you have every opportunity and every good reason to be advocating, not waiting, but advocating, giving the governor and the legislators and anybody else in government some good ideas for how to do it right. Okay, I'm off the soapbox. So that's the main things we wanted to talk about in the law. Tiffany and I are not experts on education policy or vaccines or childcare or things like that. Those are other provisions in there. We've done some writing in the area, and our colleague organizations, national organizations that focus on those issues, have developed plenty of material. So wanted to talk about what's next, because this week and next month are critical times for the nonprofit community as well as policy making. The president proposed his 2.0, 2.3, $2.5 trillion American jobs plan. That's called the infrastructure plan. The definition of infrastructure is in the eye of the beholder. Republicans have been complaining that, or been saying that infrastructure means roads and bridges and waterways, and that this goes far beyond that. And yes, the president's proposal does go far beyond to cover a lot of other things, including broadband, which is something that most nonprofits have come around to say this is an important issue. He would pay for the American Jobs Plan with corporate tax increases. So raising the tax rate for corporations from 21%, which was enacted as part of the 2017 tax reforms, raising it to 28%. Some are saying 25% tax is better. So that's still on the corporate side. This week, the president's expected to provide more details, not legislative text, but more details on his American Families Plan. That's been nicknamed the Human Infrastructure Bill. And you can see some of the things in there. It's childcare, universal pre-K, free community colleges, I think will be in there. This is all rumor and innuendo so far. You have a lot of people here in DC suggesting things are going to be in it, wishing it would be true. So we won't know until we see the draft. And even when we see the draft, things will change 1,000 times. So we won't know until and if the president signs any of this into law. Also, national paid leave is the hottest topic that we're seeing this week, that we saw this morning. And then to pay for this $2.1 trillion, $2.5 trillion package. Again, moving scale, all best guesses until we see it. Will be tax hikes on the rich only. An issue of notoriety, and one that has caught the attention of nonprofits for a while now. During the campaign, candidate Biden proposed capping the value of itemized deductions at the 28% tax bracket. That's the exact same proposal that President Obama proposed 3 months into right about the 100th day of his administration. Nonprofit community came out strongly opposed to that because it would curb the tax benefit of those who itemize deductions and those who donate to charitable nonprofits. The world has changed. The 2017 tax law doubled the standard deduction. Tax law is in flux right now, but there's the expectation that the president's proposal will, among many other things, will propose capping the itemized deductions at 28% tax bracket, as opposed to the 34 or 33 or whatever the top bracket is. I bring it up because we'll probably be writing a lot about it. The concern is that the concern isn't that rich people will lose a tax break. The stated concern isn't that nonprofits will get fewer donations and won't make payroll. Those all may be true, but those aren't the best way to advocate for it. The concern is that donations will dry up and that children won't get the meals, veterans won't get the training, all the things, the mission critical things we do will not be available when donations go down. So there'll be a lot of focus on this if it happens. I'm stressing if, because we don't know yet. But so we're expecting a hue and cry and a flurry of advocacy activities. But before it comes out, I want to say in 2009, President Obama proposed it and it never was introduced into law by Congress. Charitable nonprofits are respected in Congress. We don't get enough respect in that they don't go out of their way to ask us first, And we have to fight like crazy to get included, like the CARES Act and everything else we've talked about. But most politicians don't want to go out of their way to smite all charitable nonprofits. And the cap on itemized deductions that would also be applied to a charitable deductions for itemizers is something that has never received popular support in Congress. This is a new Congress, it's not been tested, but we're expecting a lot of frantic advocacy in the next month or 2 or 3 or years. But we've won it before, and we can win it again when we stick together, when we advocate, when we work together. Other topics coming up are budget appropriations, other bills, that solar tax credit may be a big deal in Nebraska and Western Iowa. Lots of other good ideas, bad ideas, immigration reform proposals will affect nonprofits in one way or another, depending on your focus area and so forth. Just wanted to go there. Nonprofit priorities. Ann mentioned this from the outset, that we, National Council of Nonprofits, we, the network of the National Council of Nonprofits, have been working extremely closely with national nonprofits, regional nonprofits, on behalf of the nonprofit community during this pandemic to ensure nonprofits are heard and to get the best deals possible so that nonprofits can continue to advance their missions. We've had our priorities have moved over time. Getting included in the PPP was a priority. Check that one. Currently, 2021, new Congress, new administration, now that the American Rescue Plan Act has been enacted, the broad nonprofit community has 4 policy priorities. First is that we will be advocating for on an ongoing basis. The first one listed there is the Work Now Act. That's one that was introduced last year by Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota. Many Democratic senators and a few representatives have signed on to the bill. This is not a bipartisan bill yet, but let me give you a detail or two. The program, it calls for creating a $50 billion grant program for nonprofits, only for nonprofits. 40 billion of it would pass through to the states and local governments that would be required to use the money to issue grants to nonprofits to hire people. So imagine, best example there, when the pandemic hit, the Los Angeles Food Bank had to tell its 120 volunteers they couldn't come because they were mostly old people who were immune challenged and so forth. They lost all their volunteers, stopped coming. They lost their volunteers, so they had to hire 120 people. Great news is 120 unemployed people were brought to work for the food bank. Imagine if all nonprofits or many nonprofits could get grant money to bring back your laid off employees and to hire more people, newly unemployed people who are out of work because of the pandemic, whether it's restaurants or movie theaters or whatever, to work in the nonprofit. It's based on the notion that nonprofits are the ultimate shovel-ready project, meaning I have never known or never worked with a nonprofit that was overstaffed, that had too many employees. Most of us we're understaffed, under-resourced, and we can't. If we had more people, we would be able to do more. That's the concept of the Work Now Act. I said 40% would go through the state and local governments and tribal governments. The other 20% would go to national or regional intermediary organizations. Those are groups, think Meals on Wheels or Habitat for Humanity, that has a national network that could pursue specific agenda items or specific mission-focused areas that include hiring people. I see that Tiffany's popped on the screen. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So with the Work Now monies, is it possible to use that money to increase salaries of current employees? Because we know that nonprofits often aren't able to pay the same that, someone in the for-profit world would be able to pay.
You could, there is currently as currently written, there's a cap of $50,000 salaries, which would be, you could increase the pay for most people, I would presume. Most likely that number will go up because in a number of areas, the $50,000 would not cover the costs for a lot of employees. So with the caveat that the cap is a moving target, yes, you could hire more, you could pay more, but you would need to increase staff also. You couldn't just take the money and pay that money to existing staff. And the regulations have not been written. It is an excellent question that our network is running the coalition that we can actually get a clearer answer. The intent of the law is that yes, you can, but but now that you've raised it, we want to double check just to make sure, and then make sure that it's not foreclosed, and to make sure that changes are made to ensure that you could. The concept being expanding employment, and you may need to pay more to keep staff and to expand. Okay, that's that one. It's currently a partisan issue, meaning no Republicans have signed on, but we're advocating, and our coalition is working diligently to bring in Republican sponsors, because this is community. This is hiring people in the community. Nonprofits better than anybody with more resources could hire people immediately, and that money wouldn't go to profits. That money wouldn't go to a lot of other things that for-profits or government might spend it on. It would go to the exact purpose. So we think there's a good shot. Next item is the universal charitable deduction. That's kind of a buzzword for expanding the charitable giving incentives in the CARES Act. You'll recall the CARES Act created a non-itemized deduction, a deduction for people taking the standard deduction, a lot of terms for it. CARES Act created a $300 deduction so that people who take the standard deduction could also deduct the first $300 of their charitable giving in addition to the standard deduction. That was good news. It was progress, not enough, but progress. The end of the year tax law, or the end of the year COVID law, says that you could take 300 as an individual or 600 as a couple, and take the standard deduction for 2021. Legislation is out there to expand that, to first continue it to 2022, and to raise that from $600 for a couple, or $300 for an individual, to $6,000 for an individual and $8,000 or so for a couple. It's a big lift, but we're working on it. And by the time we get to a new tax legislation, whether that comes in the next few months by July 4th or so, or whether it's a year in, we're constantly making the case. People thought it would never happen. Well, we got the $300 in the CARES Act and the $600 in the year-end COVID law. So we're building and building. As you have examples of those donations for people who took the standard deduction, please let Hannah know so she can work it into the Nebraska and Western Iowa messaging on this issue. We're asking our colleagues all over the country to promote this as aggressively and hard as they can. Next item is the unemployment relief. Tiffany already gave you the bottom line here. In the American Rescue Plan, we collectively have gotten up to federal coverage for reimbursing employers of 75% of costs of benefits paid to our former employees. That's from April 1st to September 6th. That should have been 100% from the get-go. So we're advocating for 100% retroactive payments for nonprofits and 100% coverage for this year as well. The idea is nonprofits have kept people employed the best we can. But having to pay these big lump sums to the state unemployment office means we've had to lay off more people, which is just the exact opposite of what the policy should do. There's sympathy on Capitol Hill, bipartisan sympathy and recognition that nonprofits we're doing our part. Through a quirk in the law, we got clobbered, and for-profit businesses and some other nonprofits have not gotten clobbered. There ought to be parity. So that's what we're working for. And finally, on my list here is broadband. This is a bipartisan issue. Broadband access to internet is vital for kids in school, attending school from home. What we discovered is nonprofits were shut down and had to come up with new ways to engage with our communities. Imagine the Omaha Symphony that I mentioned earlier. They're able to do performances online, but not if people don't have broadband, or if they don't have broadband. Nonprofits need access to broadband to perform, to advance its missions. We also learned, we know that the people we serve also need broadband. And it's a bipartisan issue. It's something we, the nonprofit community, can help bring people together, expressing the need, and get us all to agree on broadband, and maybe we can get us all to agree on all these other issues. So it's a strategic, but also a smart policy issue that people agree on. But to get any of it, we're going to have to advocate. That's the end of our prepared materials. And you may have more questions, Tiffany.
Yeah, so we got one in the Q&A, and this goes back to the tax credit for vaccinations and time off to get your vaccine. So does that time off, the paid time off for vaccination related reasons under the American Rescue Plan, does that count as the 2-week equivalent originally granted under the FFCRA? For example, if a full-time employee had already used their 80 hours of COVID related reasons, would we not be able to receive the credit for the vaccination time off?
Short answer is no. If it's used before, the clock has been reset. I can't remember if it was the year in tax law or if it's the American Rescue Plan, but the past leave provided, the 2-week leave provided, is wiped away and you start fresh. So this year you started fresh, so you can use the credit now.
That's all the questions I've seen in the Q&A in the chat box. Does anyone have any more?
Well, then I invite everybody to join me in thanking David and Tiffany for taking time out of their day to share their expertise with us. This is incredibly helpful. They will continue to monitor what's going on with the American Rescue Plan, as well as what's in the crystal ball of what else may come. NAM is doing the same, trying to figure out how can we make sure that nonprofits have a seat at the table and not just table scraps from these programs. Stay tuned. Thanks again. This was recorded, and the slides and the recording will be sent out to everyone. So little round of applause here for our speakers.
Thank you both.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Have a good afternoon.
Bye, everyone.